The engagement dinner had exactly one rule, and I broke it in under 4 minutes. Don't let go of her hand. That was rule number one, and possibly the only rule that mattered, because the moment Ivy Calloway laced her fingers through mine beneath a chandelier the size of a small car, I understood two things at once. I was about to lie to 30 of the wealthiest, most observant people in Connecticut, and I did not, under any circumstances, want to let go of her hand. "This is my boyfriend, Daniel," she'd said to her aunt, her voice steady in a way mine never would have been. I nodded. I smiled. I did not correct her, because 6 days earlier, in a glass-walled office on the 14th floor of Meridian Press, my boss had asked me to become someone I wasn't, and I had said yes before I'd finished thinking it through. I'm a cartographer, not the kind who charts oceans anymore. Nobody pays for that, but the kind who draws the folded paper maps tucked into the back of travel guides, the ones tourists mark up with coffee rings and hopeful red circles. I spend my days deciding how a city should look small enough to fit in someone's pocket. I am, by profession and by temperament, a man who plans routes. I do not improvise, which made the entire arrangement with Ivy Calloway spectacularly out of character. She was Meridian's creative director, 29, sharp-jawed and sharper-tongued, the kind of boss who could dismantle a bad pitch in one sentence and somehow make you thank her for it. I'd worked under her for 2 years without once imagining I'd end up pretending to date her at her younger sister's engagement dinner in a house with its own name, Thornfield, carved into a stone gatepost like it had opinions about who was allowed through. 6 days before that chandelier, she'd call me into her office and close the door, which she never did. "I need a favor," she'd said, and then she'd told me about Julian. Julian was her ex-fiancé. Julian would be at her sister's wedding weekend because Julian's family and the Calloways had been trading real estate and holiday cards for 3 generations, the kind of entanglement money makes permanent. Julian, according to Ivy, had spent the last year telling anyone who'd listened that she'd never recover from him. She wanted one weekend where that wasn't true. She wanted to walk into her family's estate with somebody real enough on her arm that nobody would ask follow-up questions. "Why me?" I'd asked, which was the wrong question, because the right one, "Why would I say yes?" never got the chance to form. "Because you're the only person in this building who doesn't gossip," she'd said, "and because I trust you, and because I'll pay for the tuxedo." I should have said no. I had a mortgage, a temperamental cat, and absolutely no experience convincingly loving anyone in public. Instead, I heard myself agreeing to 3 days at Thornfield, posing as the boyfriend of a woman who terrified and fascinated me in roughly equal measure, for reasons I hadn't examined too closely, because examining them felt dangerous. That first night, the lie held. Barely. Her aunt asked how we met. Ivy answered before I could invent something clumsy. Work, obviously, though we kept it professional for a long time. Her cousin asked if I was the one who designed the maps in the back of the Iceland guide, and when I said yes, something shifted in the room, a small current of approval I hadn't earned honestly, but wasn't about to refuse. And then her father walked in. Walter Calloway moved like a man who'd once crossed deserts and never quite forgot how to conserve his steps. Silver at the temples, a compass-shaped tie clip that seemed almost too on the nose for a man I'd later learn had spent 30 years leading expeditions before retiring into a life of wine cellars and charitable boards. He crossed the room, shook my hand once, hard, and then he looked at me the way you look at a word you can almost remember. "You," he said slowly. "Do I know you?" I told him no, we'd never met, and I believed it completely. I had no idea yet how wrong I was. His eyes stayed on my face a moment too long before he let it go, smiling like a man setting aside a puzzle for later. "Family friend of your father's, perhaps," he said. "Something about you." Ivy squeezed my hand, a silent apology for her father's strangeness, and the moment passed. But I felt it land somewhere behind my ribs and stay there, unresolved, the way an unlabeled line on an old chart makes you wonder what the mapmaker was too afraid to name. Part 2. By the second morning, I'd stopped needing to remind myself of the rules. That was the problem. Thornfield sat on 11 acres of Connecticut hillside, and Ivy knew every inch of it the way I knew the negative space on a page, instinctively, without needing to look. She took me down to the boathouse before breakfast, away from the ants and the seating charts and Julian's expensive, watchful silence. And for an hour we weren't performing anything. "You're better at this than I expected," she said, sitting on the dock with her knees pulled to her chest. "At pretending? At all of it. My mother likes you. My mother doesn't like anyone." I told her that was probably because I kept agreeing with her mother's opinions on modern architecture, which were, frankly, correct, and Ivy laughed, really laughed, not the careful office version, and something in my chest rearranged itself without asking permission. We'd built rules for exactly this contingency. No real feelings. No confusing the performance for the thing itself. We were two colleagues doing each other a professional courtesy that happened to involve hand-holding and, once, at her grandmother's insistence, a slow dance in front of 40 guests. The rules had seemed sturdy in the office. Out here, with lake fog burning off the water and her shoulder an inch from mine, they felt like lines drawn on a map of a country neither of us had actually visited. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Off the record. Off the fake relationship record. Always. Why did you actually say yes? You could have told me this was insane." I thought about the honest answer, that I'd said yes the way you say yes to a door you've been standing in front of for 2 years, telling yourself it's locked, and gave her a smaller piece of the truth instead. "Because you asked," I said. "And I didn't want to be the kind of man who says no to you." She looked at me a long moment, something unguarded crossing her face before she caught it and folded it away, the way she folded away everything that might cost her something at work. "That's a terrible answer," she said quietly. "It's also the nicest thing anyone said to me all year." We didn't kiss. We came close enough that I could count her eyelashes. And then her phone buzzed with a bridesmaid emergency involving a torn hem, and the moment scattered like birds off a wire. But I carried it with me through breakfast, through the archery lesson her uncle insisted on, through the entire long golden afternoon, the way you carry a scale you haven't yet found the use for. Her father found me alone that evening, refilling my glass at the bar cart in the study. "Foster," he said, testing the name like a key in an old lock. "Not a common surname. Where's your family from originally?" "Ohio mostly," I said. "My grandfather traveled a lot for work before that." "What kind of work?" "Cartography, actually. Same as me, in a way." He drew maps for expedition outfits back in the 70s. Walter Calloway went very still. "What was his name?" he asked, and something in his voice had changed entirely. The polite dinner party warmth replaced by something closer to dread. "Edmund Foster," I said. "Did you know him?" The glass in his hand didn't shake, but his knuckles went pale around it. "I knew him very well," he said. "He was my map maker. On my last expedition before I stopped leading them." He turned toward the window, and for a moment he looked much older than he had all weekend. "He never told his family what happened out there, did he?" "No," I said, my pulse suddenly loud in my ears. "He never talked about it at all." Walter looked at me then with an expression I couldn't fully name, grief wearing the mask of relief, or maybe the other way around. "Then we have a great deal to discuss, Mr. Foster," he said. "But not tonight. Tonight, go find my daughter. She's been watching this doorway for the last 10 minutes pretending she isn't." Part 3. I didn't get the chance to ask him anything else, because the wedding weekend accelerated the way weekends do when you're not paying attention, and by the time I found space to breathe, everything had already started coming apart. It started with a photograph. Ivy's cousin had dug up an old expedition album from the library shelves. Decades of Calloway family history bound in leather, the kind of archive rich families keep instead of therapy. Somewhere in the middle of it was a black and white photo of 6 men standing in front of canvas tents, and Walter Calloway, 26 years old, stood beside a lean, serious man holding a drafting board. "That's your grandfather," Ivy said, delighted, turning the album toward me. He looks just like you. I stared at the photo longer than I should have, because something about my grandfather's expression, guarded, almost frightened, in a photograph meant to celebrate a triumphant expedition, didn't match the quiet, unremarkable man I remembered from childhood, the one who'd never once mentioned mountains. Ivy noticed. Of course she noticed. "You've gone somewhere else," she said. "I need to talk to your father," I told her, and I watched her face shift from curiosity to something more wary. "About what?" "Something he told me last night. About my grandfather." That was the wrong answer, or the right one delivered at the worst possible time, because her mother chose that exact moment to sweep into the room asking about seating arrangements, and the conversation died before it could properly begin. I told myself I'd explain everything to Ivy that evening. I was wrong about how much time I had. Walter found me first, in the map room, an actual map room, floor to ceiling with expedition charts under glass, which under different circumstances would have been the happiest place I'd ever stood in my life. "Your grandfather saved my life on that expedition," he said without preamble. "We were 4 days from base camp when a ridge gave way beneath half our party. 2 men didn't make it back. Edmund got the rest of us out using a route he drew from memory in the dark, off any existing chart. It should have made him famous. Instead, he asked me never to credit him publicly, packed up his instruments, and never took another commission. Why? I asked, though some part of me already suspected. Because one of the men we lost was his closest friend, and Edmund believed, wrongly, I've always thought, that if he'd charted the original route more carefully, it never would have happened. He carried it like a debt for the rest of his life. I tried to find him for years afterward. He never answered a letter. I thought of my grandfather's drafting table in the garage, untouched for decades, the compass I'd inherited and never once used professionally, telling myself it was sentiment rather than superstition. I thought of every time he'd changed the subject when I mentioned wanting to study cartography, the strange tightness in his voice I'd never understood. "He never told anyone," I said. "Not even us." Walter's eyes were wet. "Then I owe you an explanation older than you are," he said. "And an apology I should have delivered 30 years ago. That should have been the end of it. A sad, healing story, a debt finally settled. Instead, Ivy walked in halfway through, having heard only the last fragment. The word apology, the sight of her father's face wrecked open in front of a man she'd been introducing all weekend as someone he wasn't. "What's going on?" she said, and her voice had the particular calm of someone bracing for betrayal. I started to explain. I got as far as my grandfather's name before she held up a hand. "You knew this whole weekend," she said. "You knew there was some connection to my family, and you didn't think that was worth mentioning to the woman you're supposed to be." She stopped herself, because supposed to be was the whole architecture of the lie, and saying it out loud in front of her father made the walls visible. "I found out the same night you did," I said. "I was going to tell you." "When?" "After the toasts? After my sister's first dance?" Ivy's composure cracked at the edges. The version of her I'd only glimpsed at the boathouse breaking through in front of exactly the wrong audience. "I don't even know what this weekend was anymore," she said. "I don't know if any of it was real, or if I just handed you a front row seat to unravel some old family secret." "That's not what this was," I said, and I meant it more than I'd meant almost anything. But the words landed in a room already too full of history to hold them. "I need air," she said, and left before I could follow, before I could tell her the part that actually mattered, that somewhere between the dock and the archery lesson and the almost kiss in the study, the pretending had stopped being pretending, at least for me, and I had no idea how to prove that to someone who now had every reason to doubt every version of me she'd met that weekend. Part 4. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the guest room with my grandfather's compass in my palm, turning it over the way you turn over a decision you can't yet make. And somewhere around 4 in the morning, I understood what I actually had to do, which was the opposite of what came naturally to me. I had to stop planning the safe route and take the one that risked everything. I found Ivy at sunrise, back at the boathouse, the one place on the property that still felt like ours instead of her family's. "You should be sleeping," she said, not looking at me. I couldn't. I sat down beside her, close enough to matter, far enough to respect the distance she'd put between us. "I owe you the whole truth," I said. "Not the fake boyfriend version. The real one." She didn't answer, but she didn't leave either, so I kept going. "I said yes to this weekend because I've wanted an excuse to stand closer to you for 2 years and never had one," I told her. "I didn't know about my grandfather and your father until the second night, and I should have told you the moment I found out instead of trying to protect you from a conversation that clearly needed to happen. That was wrong. But everything else, the boathouse, the dance, the way I felt every single hour I've spent pretending to be someone lucky enough to actually have you, none of that was fake. That was the only honest thing happening all weekend." Ivy turned to look at me for the first time since the map room. "My father spent half the night telling me about your grandfather," she said quietly. "About the debt he carried. About how some people would rather disappear than let anyone see the cost of what they did for someone else." I didn't say anything, because I understood, suddenly, exactly what she meant. "You do that too," she said. "You almost let me walk away without telling me the truth because you thought protecting me mattered more than being honest with me. That's the family trait, apparently. Noble silence." "I don't want to be silent anymore," I said. "I want to draw this out in the open where you can actually see it." I reached for her hand, the same hand I'd held under that chandelier 4 days earlier for entirely the wrong reasons, and this time I held it for exactly one reason. "I'm not asking you to forgive the timing," I said. "I'm asking you to believe that everything underneath it was real. It still is." The fog was burning off the lake the way it had that first morning, gold light spreading slow across the water, and Ivy studied my face like she was deciding whether to trust a chart drawn by an unsteady hand. "Say it without the metaphor," she said finally. "No maps, no compasses. Just tell me." "I love you," I said. "I have for longer than this weekend, and longer than I let myself admit even to you." She exhaled like she'd been holding that breath for 2 years too. "That's annoyingly overdue," she said, and then she kissed me, and it tasted like relief and lake water and every unspoken thing we'd been circling since the day she closed her office door. Her father found us an hour later, still at the dock, and instead of interrupting, he simply set 2 mugs of coffee on the boathouse railing and walked away, smiling the way he had that first night, like a man who finally understood the puzzle he'd been turning over. Epilogue. We told her family the truth eventually, the whole absurd shape of it, the favor that became a courtship, the grandfather who'd vanished into silence, and the compass that led his grandson, decades later, straight back to the family he'd once saved. Walter framed the old expedition photograph and hung it in the map room beside a new one. Ivy and me at her sister's wedding, dancing under the same chandelier where the lie had started and the truth had eventually taken over. We were married 18 months later at Thornfield, on the lawn overlooking the boathouse, because Ivy said some places deserve a second, truer ending. I designed the map for the wedding programs myself, a small illustrated chart of the estate, with a red pin marking the dock, labeled simply, "Where it became real." Walter gave the toast. He talked about debts finally paid and routes finally finished, and when he raised his glass to me, he called me son in a voice that still carried 30 years of grief transformed, finally, into something gentler. These days, my drafting table sits by the window in the house we bought 2 towns over from Thornfield, and Ivy's sketches for the magazine's spring covers are pinned above it, overlapping my half-finished charts like 2 languages learning to share a page. Every anniversary, we take the same dock at sunrise with 2 mugs of coffee, and every year, she asks the same question. "Still real?" she says. "Still real," I tell her. Always was, underneath. What would you have done if your boss asked you to fake date them for a family wedding, only to fall for them for real? Have you ever had a pretend relationship turn into something you never planned on? Tell me your version in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one delivered straight to you every week with zero ads, our membership is open, so come join us there. If this one got you, drop a like, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.